The Idaho legislature is unique in how it tries to draw a distinction between fiscal and social policy, but the distinction is largely artificial. This is because the dollars and cents are what make an impact. What gets funded or defunded can have substantial impacts on Idaho's culture. Sex education grants are one of these components of federal spending that don't have a huge number tied to them, but are far-reaching in their social impacts. And in Idaho's experience, these impacts are detrimental to our youth in the K-12 education system. In response, conservatives in the legislature and the Idaho Freedom Foundation worked together to strip or redirect more than $700,000 in federal sex ed grants endorsed by Planned Parenthood. This works to preserve the innocence of Idaho children and restore the position of parents as the primary educators for their children. This week on Fiscal Fridays, we sat down with Anna Miller, Director of the Center for American Education at the Idaho Freedom Foundation, to discuss this major budget win. Anna is an Austrian-trained economist, a mother, and a well-published policy expert. Here was our discussion.
All right, Anna, thank you for joining us on Fiscal Fridays today. I'm glad that you were able to talk about this issue with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so it wasn't that long ago that you and Dr. Scott Yanna released a bombshell report talking about porn literacy in our public school system. And this was incredibly shocking to Idahoans and parents across the nation. A lot of really big news outlets picked up on that story. And so could you please give us a really good overview of the depth of this thing that's in our public schools and is harming our children?
Yeah, so when we wrote the article about porn literacy in Idaho K-12 schools, we were talking about a program called Reducing the Risk that's implemented by our Department of Health and Welfare through public health districts into Idaho schools. And this program is funded by a federal grant, and it just so happens that the federal government gives guidance to entities that accept these grants. Part of the guidance that they give them is to implement LGBTQ ideology. Another part of the guidance that they give them is to follow national sexuality education standards. Another part of this is to adopt certain curriculum. They have certain school-based curriculum that the federal government has approved that entities accepting these grants must use. And so Reducing the Risk is one of those programs. And it just so happens that most of those programs, including Reducing the Risk, are endorsed by Planned Parenthood. And they're sold by a group that encourages the normalization of the consumption of pornography, education, training, and research. And this group provided training to educators on one health district, North Central Health District up in North Idaho. Through the Reducing the Risk program, they were offering teachers training in porn literacy, queering sex ed, all sorts of other concerning practices that, just if a parent just heard the words porn literacy, they don't want their child to be taught something of that nature. They don't want pornography to be normalized to their child. And this was happening through this federally funded sex education program implemented all across Idaho.
And how many schools actually implemented this program? So I heard it was quite a few, actually.
Yeah, so the Department of Health and Welfare implemented this program in 14 schools across Idaho through public health districts. But that's just the piece of the programs that are federally funded. Any school across Idaho could be using any of these sex education curricula that the Department of Health and Human Services, the federal department, deems medically accurate and evidence-based. So it's not just relegated to these 14 schools, although those are the ones that are being implemented with federal dollars. Any school across Idaho could be using any of these curricula that are endorsed by Planned Parenthood and deemed scientifically valid by HHS.
Wow. So it sounds like this issue is runs a bit deeper than we actually can even really tell just with public records requests. So just to discuss the bill, so we were able to get these funds actually cut out through our work with the Idaho legislature. So ironically, the grants that we were able to cut completely were the sexual risk avoidance education grants and the personal responsibility education program. And between those two grants, that was about $580,000 in spending. But what was even more pervasive was that there was funding through the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program in the amount of about $140,000 And the bill also redirected these funds out of the sex education curricula and out of the budgets of our Idaho Department of Health and Welfare, so that this reducing the risk program doesn't get funded. So are these grants another example of how federal strings are attached and how they affect state monetary policy?
Yeah, absolutely they are. And it is a huge win, by the way, that the legislature cut funding for these sex education programs. It's an absolutely huge win for families across the state of Idaho. So yes, absolutely, this is an example of how federal strings attached to funding affect policy. Anyone who's on a budget committee who thinks that all they're doing is just blindly voting on numbers and their job is just to allocate money to different programs, regardless of what those programs fund, is not doing their job very well. Their job actually is to look at whether or not the things that they are funding are good, are things that are healthy for the public, things that especially when it comes to school-age children, things that are appropriate for school-age children. And so the reason that this program got into Idaho in the first place is because no one was scrutinizing these federal dollars. No one was looking at what HHS was actually pushing. They're told this is scientifically valid, it's medically accurate, it's evidence-based, and they have no idea that the curriculum that they're adopting by accepting these federal funds is actually endorsed by Planned Parenthood, teaches transgender ideology to kids, endorses all manner of sexual activity, and is something that most parents would not want their child to be taught. And so it's absolutely an example of federal strings affecting monetary policy, and our legislators should be much more careful when they accept these funds.
Amen to that. And you brought up some of things that is some of the things that are included in this curricula. So you said the transgender ideology and things like that. So what exactly are our kids learning in schools that have implemented this program?
So it depends on the curriculum, obviously. HHS recommends, a variety of curriculums, about 30 different curricula. They generally all teach different versions of the same few things. Reducing the Risk, again, is one of those programs. It teaches transgender ideology to kids. It endorses all manner of sexual activity, anal sex, oral sex, vaginal sex, things that I don't feel very comfortable talking about publicly. It's teaching these things to kids that could be as young as 12 years old. It teaches kids about sex toys. It teaches kids about abortion. It directs kids to Planned Parenthood clinics. It teaches kids about things like Plan B, abortifacients. And there's a number of other concerning things in the program too. Another aspect that's concerning, again, going back to what we were originally talking about in your first question, is the kind of trainings for educators that are associated with these programs that are then meant to affect what is taught in the classroom. And so this is a very big problem. And I would definitely encourage parents to go look on our website at some of the screenshots that we have of the curriculum, to get a full copy of the curriculum if they're able to ask their school districts for full copies of any sex education curriculum that's taught, because often these programs are disguised as abstinence. But what they don't realize is that Planned Parenthood has actually redefined abstinence. And these programs adhere to national sexuality standards, also in part written by Planned Parenthood, that also redefine abstinence. And so a parent's general understanding of something like abstinence, that these programs are going to teach kids to abstain from sex until marriage, is just not accurate. It's been redefined to be consistent with actually the promotion of sex and teaching kids about gender identity, puberty blockers, all sorts of very alarming subjects.
Wow. And kind of building on that, actually, building on the definition of abstinence, and the loophole that they were exploiting was that it wasn't defined in Idaho code. And you would think that the word itself would actually be enough of a definition for everybody to understand what that meant, but apparently not in these curricula. So earlier this year, House Bill 228 passed the legislature, actually defining abstinence in Idaho code. From your experience being working in this policy space, will House Bill 228 address the issue adequately to prevent this from being taught in our schools?
So House Bill 228 establishes that abstinence means abstaining from sex until marriage. So essentially what this amounts to is a parental rights sort of transparency bill. So right now, schools that might be teaching reducing the risk, or another curriculum that pretends to teach abstinence but doesn't really teach the traditional definition of abstinence, instead they smuggle in moral corruption under the same label, they can no longer do that now that this bill has been passed. They actually can't call it abstinence. They have to align their curriculum to our new state standards that define abstinence according to House Bill 228, the traditional understanding of abstinence. So what this bill does is it establishes that parents can't be deceived in being told that their kid is going to be taught abstinence. They have to be told the truth about what's actually in the curriculum. They can't just call it abstinence. And so I just want to applaud Senator Cindy Carlson and Representative Barbara Ehart, who has been working on this issue for years, for getting this done. They did an excellent job carrying this legislation, and it is a very strong first step. However, to answer your question, is it enough? It's certainly a step in the right direction. It's an important thing to have accomplished. However, it's not enough because this legislation, again, it's just basically a curriculum transparency parental rights legislation. It doesn't stop any district from instructing children through these problematic curriculum endorsed by Planned Parenthood. They could be using reducing the risk. They could be using any number of the other approximately 30 comprehensive sex ed curricula that are popular out there that are endorsed by the federal government as well. So it doesn't stop this issue overall. It doesn't necessarily stop a school district from implementing these programs. It's just sort of a transparency bill. So absolutely more needs to be done, but I do applaud our legislature for getting this done and for paying attention to this very important issue.
And it really seems like for some things that you would think would be common sense, like a library bill, it can be very difficult for the legislature to actually accomplish something. So for them to accomplish something like this is a really big deal. To build on, you mentioned a few times that these curricula were endorsed by Planned Parenthood, and you and Dr. Yenner dig into this in a new report that you released with the Claremont Institute. And it's particularly chilling to know just how intertwined Planned Parenthood is in the sex education of our children. And so how does Planned Parenthood exert their influence on these programs through these federal grants that are being funneled into our state?
So Planned Parenthood has gained control over the 4 big sex education grant programs that the federal government implements, in part through just strategic control of the administrative state. And they have succeeded in winning about 80% of all federal grant funds through these 4 programs. So it's about $167 million. Now, that might not sound like a huge amount, but the issue here is that this is industry creation. The federal government is funding an industry that might not exist otherwise, because parents certainly aren't demanding for their children to be taught this gender ideology. However, federal bureaucrats are perfectly fine with it. So Planned Parenthood is very well coordinated. They get their affiliates and their allies to apply for these grants, and they win, again, 80% of these funds. And then they also help develop national standards, national sexuality education standards, which include teaching, 3rd graders about puberty blockers, teaching elementary school teachers about gender identity, and a number of other concerning topics. And then they start establishing a huge variety of curriculum around this. So Education, Training, and Research, who's sort of the publishing arm of Planned Parenthood, they offer, about a variety of 30 different curricula, the majority of which are endorsed by Planned Parenthood or delivered to students themselves. And so they've just created this massive, what we call a sex ed industrial complex. It's sort of an iron triangle where Congress funds and then Planned Parenthood delivers the services.
That's crazy. It sounds like they're quite intertwined in the industry, and they almost have a monopoly on the whole system. It sounds like. So now it's important to remember that though we have this budget win for fiscal year 2024, budget wins should be treated as temporary victories, because they could easily be changed the following year. Once the budget's up for consideration again, everything's back on the table. So this means that funding for these programs could be added back into the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare budget next year if lawmakers don't remain vigilant. So from your perspective as an expert on this topic, what would you say needs to be done to ensure that this harmful ideology gets rooted out of the Idaho education system going forward?
So if we're talking about radical gender ideology as a whole, I'm not sure it's possible to root it out of the public education system entirely because it is so deeply ingrained, right? We're not just talking about comprehensive sex education programs. We're also talking about school policies regarding things like gender support plans for students that are transitioning. We're talking about pornographic books in school libraries. We're talking about school clubs like GSA clubs. We're talking about teacher education programs that are colleges and universities that instruct teachers in gender ideology. We're talking about teacher training in our public schools and a whole host of other complex issues. We're talking about the interest groups that work with schools and push gender ideology. How do we get it out of schools? I'm not sure that that's the right approach. I think the better approach, the more promising approach would be to decentralize the decision-making powers of the existing public education monopoly by returning funds back to families so that they can make decisions for their own children. If they're okay with their local public school that may be steeped in gender ideology, they can continue sending their child there. And if not, then they have the funds that they need to give their child education that is more suited to their family's moral and religious values. Now, as far as solving the sex education issue specifically, there is a number of other things that the legislature can do. As you mentioned, they can continue to reject the federal funds. They absolutely should remain vigilant, continue to do that. There are red states that have done that for a long time, such as Florida. However, if a state does not accept these funds, the federal government can use their competitive funding streams and just go over the state, and they can actually fund an interest group in the area. They could fund a Planned Parenthood in the state. They could fund another organization that's willing to deliver this type of education to children. So really what needs to be done is the state needs to ban any school from using curricula or allowing students to be instructed in curricula that follows the national sexuality education standards, or potentially preventing schools from following any program that has been approved by HHS unless it is truly an abstinence-only program. So they could mandate that all sex education curriculum in schools be true abstinence only until marriage, which there are curricula out there that follow that type of a standard. Another option, of course, would just be to remove sex education from public schools. That would probably be preferable. And it's also aligned with Idaho law, which says that things like sex education are the primary responsibility of the family and the church. And so that's one of the big things that the state could do and something that legislature should be looking to in the next session.
It sounds like our lawmakers have a lot to think about going into the budget making process next year, especially as we consider a public school budget that's now exceeded $3.3 billion and probably will continue to go up next year. So quite a lot to stew over. Anna, thank you for joining us this week on Fiscal Fridays. It was a pleasure having you, and thank you for offering your insights into this issue and for attacking this issue. Nobody else in the country is touching this issue, and so we appreciate you doing such great work on it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this great discussion with Anna. To see more of Anna's work, past episodes of Fiscal Fridays, legislative analyses, articles, and more, please visit idahofreedom.org.